Sometimes a child's desperate plea can change everything. In 1880's frontier town, 9-year-old Ruthie clutched 3 crumpled bills, begging for medicine her mama needed to survive. The shopkeeper's polite refusal echoed as wealthier customers waited behind her. Ruthie's voice cracked, hope fading, until a gruff voice interrupted from behind. Sheriff Silas Dorsey, a 60-year-old cattle baron with decades of regret, stepped forward. Something about Ruthie's courage reminded him of his daughter, lost to fever when the pharmacy closed too soon. Silas didn't just pay for medicine that day. He paid attention to what his community had forgotten. But would one act of kindness heal a town divided by wealth and silence? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dusty streets of Cedar Creek had seen better days. Much like most everything else in this corner of Montana territory, wooden sidewalks creaked under the weight of worn boots, and the sun beat down mercilessly on weathered storefronts that lined Main Street like tired soldiers standing at attention. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, but pretended not to, especially when that business involved the uncomfortable truth about who had money and who did not. Ruthie Mae Johnson lived in a one-room cabin on the edge of town, where the respectable neighborhoods gave way to ramshackle homes and broken dreams. At 9 years old, she possessed the kind of quiet wisdom that comes from watching her mama struggle through each day with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. The cabin walls were thin enough that every cough, every labored breath from her mama's bedside, echoed through their small world like thunder before a storm. Clara Johnson had been beautiful once. Everyone in town remembered that. Before the fever took hold and settled deep in her chest, before her husband ran off to chase gold that existed only in his imagination, before the weight of single motherhood pressed down on her shoulders like a stone. Now she lay propped against pillows that Ruthie fluffed every morning, her dark skin pale and drawn, her breathing shallow and rattling. "Mama's got the consumption," old Mrs. Henderson had whispered to her neighbor, just loud enough for Ruthie to hear. Poor child don't know what's coming, but Ruthie knew more than folks gave her credit for. She knew the sound of her mama's cough meant another sleepless night. She knew the way Clara clutched the silver locket at her throat, the only thing of value they still owned, meant she was thinking about selling it again. She knew that the medicine at Hoffman's apothecary could help, because she'd heard Doc Peterson mention it to the banker's wife just last week. What Ruthie didn't know was whether $3 would be enough. The money had come from odd jobs around town: sweeping Mrs. Patterson's porch, collecting eggs for the Miller family, mending fence posts for anyone willing to pay a child's wage. Each coin had been earned through calloused hands and a determination that burned brighter than the fever in her mama's. Chestnut Sheriff Silas Dorsey had been watching this quiet drama unfold from his office window for weeks. At 60, he carried himself with the careful dignity of a man who had learned that authority meant nothing without compassion, and compassion meant nothing without action. His weathered hands bore the scars of a lifetime spent working cattle and enforcing justice in equal measure, and his steel-gray eyes missed little that happened in his town. The badge on his vest had been worn smooth by decades of service, but the weight of it felt heavier these days, especially when he thought about Sarah. Sarah Dorsey had been 8 years old when the fever took her, back in '67, when Cedar Creek's only doctor had gone to tend wounded soldiers instead of sick children. Silas and his late wife Margaret had held vigil beside their daughter's bed for 6 days and nights, watching helplessly as her small body fought a battle it could never win. The memory still visited him in quiet moments, as fresh and sharp as broken glass. He'd built his ranch into one of the most prosperous spreads in the territory afterward, as if success could somehow balance the scales of loss. The Dorsey cattle brand was respected from here to Denver, and his word carried weight in business circles that stretched far beyond Cedar Creek's dusty borders. But all the money in the world couldn't bring back a little girl's laughter, couldn't undo the choices that haunted a father's dreams. The irony wasn't lost on him. that Cedar Creek now had everything it had lacked when Sarah died. A proper doctor, a well-stocked apothecary, even a small clinic that his own donations had helped establish. Yet here was another child, desperate for medicine, that sat just out of reach behind a counter that might as well have been a mountain. Hoffman's apothecary occupied the corner building where Main Street met Cedar Avenue, its large windows displaying rows of brown bottles and gleaming brass scales that seemed to promise healing for those who could afford it. Heinrich Hoffmann had arrived from back east with modern ideas about medicine and commerce, along with an unfortunate tendency to treat poverty as a moral failing rather than a circumstance. The man wasn't cruel, exactly. He simply operated his business with the kind of cold efficiency that prioritized profit margins over human need. His customers appreciated the professional atmosphere, the clean counters, the sense that they were receiving the finest medical care available in the territory. Those who couldn't pay full price learned to shop elsewhere, or do without. On this particular afternoon, the apothecary bustled with the usual crowd of well-dressed patrons. Mrs. Carmichael examined bottles of patent medicine with the careful attention of someone who had never worried about the price. The banker, Mr. Thornton, collected his monthly supply of stomach powders while discussing cattle prices with his associate. These were people accustomed to having their needs met promptly and courteously, people who belonged in spaces like this. Ruthie had waited outside for nearly an hour, watching through the window until the store seemed less crowded. She'd practiced her words, counted her money twice, and whispered a prayer to a god she hoped was listening. The silver locket around her mama's neck contained a photograph of her grandmother, a woman Ruthie had never met, but whose fierce eyes seemed to say that Johnson women didn't give up without a fight. When she finally pushed through the door, the small bell above announced her arrival with a cheerful chime that felt oddly out of place. The conversations in the store didn't stop, exactly, but they shifted, becoming more hushed, more careful, as if the presence of a poorly dressed child somehow changed the nature of the establishment. Ruthie approached the counter with her shoulders squared and her chin raised, every inch of her small frame radiating the kind of dignity that poverty couldn't diminish. She placed her 3 crumpled dollar bills on the polished wood surface and looked up at Heinrich Hoffmann with eyes that held more hope than any 9-year-old should need to carry. "Please." "Sir," she said, her voice clear and steady despite the hammering of her heart. "My mama needs medicine for her cough. Doc Peterson said you have something that might help." Hoffmann glanced at the money, then at the child, then at his other customers who had grown quiet enough to hear every word. His expression wasn't unkind, but it wasn't encouraging either. The look of a businessman who had learned to separate personal sympathy from professional necessity. Behind Ruthie, Sheriff Dorsey had entered the store quietly, his presence unnoticed by most as he browsed the shelves near the back. But his attention was focused entirely on the small drama unfolding at the counter. On the way, this child's courage echoed across the years to remind him of another little girl who had needed help that never came. The afternoon sun slanted through the apothecary's windows, casting long shadows that seemed to divide the store into those who belonged and those who merely hoped. In a few moments, Ruthie's carefully rehearsed plea would meet Hoffmann's practiced refusal, and another child would learn that sometimes wanting something desperately wasn't enough. But Sheriff Silas Dorsey was done watching children suffer while adults counted profits and made excuses. This time someone would be listening. This time someone would act. This time the story would end differently. Heinrich Hoffmann studied the 3 crumpled bills on his counter with the same clinical detachment he might have shown examining a questionable specimen under his microscope. His pale fingers drummed once against the polished wood before he spoke, his German accent lending a formal distance to words that might have seemed kinder in another voice. "I'm sorry, child, but the medicine you're asking for, laudanum tincture with glycerin, costs $8. What you have here," he gestured to the bills without touching them, "this is not sufficient." Ruthie's heart sank like a stone dropped in deep water, but she didn't step back from the counter. Instead, she pressed closer, rising up on her tiptoes until she could see over the display of patent medicines to meet Hoffman's eyes directly. "Please, sir, this is all I have, but my mama is real sick. She can't hardly breathe at night, and the coughing keeps getting worse. Doc Peterson said you might could help us. Doc Peterson should have informed you of the cost before sending you. Here," Hoffman's voice carried the weary patience of a man who had weathered countless similar requests. "Medicine is not charity, young lady. These preparations require expensive ingredients, skilled compounding, proper storage. The prices reflect the quality of care you receive." Behind Ruthie, Mrs. Carmichael shifted uncomfortably, her silk dress rustling like autumn leaves. The banker, Mr. Thornton, found sudden interest in reading the labels on nearby bottles. Even the store clerk, young Tommy Walsh, seemed to shrink behind the weight scale as if trying to disappear entirely. "I can work," Ruthie said, her voice rising slightly with desperate hope. "I can sweep your floors, organize your shelves, whatever you need. I'm a good worker, sir." "Mrs. Patterson says so." Hoffman sighed, not unkindly, but with the finality of a door closing. "This is a place of business, not a charity ward. I have employees to pay, rent to cover, suppliers to satisfy. If I gave medicine away to everyone with a sad story, I would be out of business within a month." The words hit Ruthie like physical blows, each one chipping away at the hope she'd carried through weeks of extra chores and skipped meals. Her small hands pressed flat against the counter, as if she could somehow anchor herself against the tide of disappointment, threatening to pull her under. "But she's gonna die." The words came out as barely more than a whisper, but in the hushed store, they seemed to echo like a shout. "My mama's gonna die if she don't get help. And you got the medicine right there behind you." For a moment, something flickered across Hoffman's expression. Perhaps recognition of the terrible simplicity of her statement, or memory of his own children back in Philadelphia. But the moment passed, replaced by the practiced composure of a businessman who had learned to separate emotion from enterprise. "I'm truly sorry about your mother's condition," he said, reaching across the counter to gently push the 3 bills back toward Ruthie. "But I cannot help you with this amount. Perhaps you might speak with Reverend McKinley about organizing some kind of church collection. Or I'll take it." The voice came from the back of the store, deep and gravelly, carrying the kind of quiet authority that made everyone turn without thinking. Sheriff Silas Dorsey stepped into the light streaming through the front windows, his boots making no sound on the wooden floor despite his considerable size. He moved past the startled customers with the unhurried grace of a man comfortable with being the center of attention, his weathered hands already reaching for his wallet. When he reached the counter, he placed a protective hand on Ruthie's shoulder, not possessive, but supportive, like a grandfather claiming his kin. "The laudanum tincture," Silas said, his steel-gray eyes fixed on Hoffman's face, "and whatever else Doc Peterson recommended for respiratory ailments. Put it on my account." Hoffman's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly around the edges. Sheriff Dorsey's account was substantial, his credit unquestioned, his influence in town considerable. But this request put the apothecary in an uncomfortable position, caught between business as usual and the unpredictable currents of small-town politics. "Sheriff, I appreciate your gesture," Hoffman said carefully. "But perhaps this matter would be better handled through proper channels. The Church Relief Fund or the County Assistance Program." "The child's mother is sick now," Silas interrupted, his voice carrying no anger but absolute resolve. "Not next week when the committees meet, not next month when the paperwork clears. Now." Ruthie looked up at this unexpected champion with wonder and disbelief warring in her dark eyes. She'd seen Sheriff Dorsey around town, of course. Everyone knew him by sight. But he'd always seemed as distant and untouchable as the mountains that ringed their valley. Rich men didn't typically concern themselves with the troubles of poor children, especially not poor children who looked like her. "Mister," she said softly, tugging at his coat sleeve, "you don't even know me." Silas looked down at her, and for a heartbeat everyone in the store could see the ghost of old grief pass across his features. When he spoke, his voice was gentler than anyone had heard in years. "I know what it's like to lose someone who didn't have to die," he said, "and I know what it's like to live with that afterward." The simple honesty of the statement seemed to drain the tension from the store. Mrs. Carmichael dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Mr. Thornton cleared his throat and found pressing business elsewhere. Even Hoffman's resistance appeared to waver in the face of such raw sincerity. "Very well," the apothecary said finally, turning to retrieve bottles from the shelf behind him. "The standard treatment for consumption symptoms: laudanum tincture, expectorant syrup, and mustard plasters for chest congestion." As Hoffman worked, measuring and mixing with practiced efficiency, Ruthie remained pressed against the counter, as if afraid this miraculous reversal might evaporate like morning mist. The 3 crumpled bills lay forgotten on the polished wood, looking suddenly small and insignificant beside the expensive bottles being prepared for her mamma's salvation. "Why?" she asked Silas, her voice barely audible. "Why are you helping us?" Silas was quiet for a long moment, watching Hoffman's careful preparations. On the shelf behind the counter sat Doc Peterson's leather medical bag, the same black satchel that had been useless to save his Sarah, that carried all the tools of healing except the will to use them for those who couldn't pay, "because someone should have helped my daughter when she needed it," he said finally. "Because this town forgot what it means to take care of its own. And because you remind me that there's still time to remember." When Hoffman finished, he wrapped the medicines in brown paper and tied the package with string, his movements precise and professional despite the unusual circumstances of the transaction. He placed the package on the counter beside a small card with detailed instructions, then stepped back with the air of a man who had completed a difficult but necessary task. Ruthie gathered the precious package to her chest, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall. The medicine felt warm in her arms, heavy with promise and possibility. For the first time in weeks, hope felt like something more than foolish dreaming. "Thank you," she said to Silas, the words inadequate but heartfelt. "I don't know how to pay you back, but I will. Somehow I will." Silas smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd shown in months. "You already have, child. You already have." As they left the apothecary together, the aging sheriff and the determined little girl, neither fully understood how this moment would ripple outward through their small town, touching lives and changing hearts in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Behind them, Hoffman watched through his window, absently polishing his glasses, as he wondered when exactly his business had become something more complicated than simple commerce. The afternoon sun cast long shadows down Main Street, and somewhere in those shadows, the future was quietly rearranging itself around a single act of unexpected kindness. The walk back to the cabin felt different with the medicine clutched in her arms. Ruthie moved with careful, measured steps, as if she were carrying something that might break if jostled too hard. The brown paper package crinkled softly with each movement, a sound that seemed to promise relief from the endless nights of watching her mama struggle for breath. The cabin came into view as she rounded the bend past Miller's Creek, its weathered boards and patched roof suddenly looking less like poverty and more like home. Smoke drifted from the chimney in lazy spirals, which meant Clara had managed to keep the fire going, a good sign, since the worst days left her too weak even for simple tasks. Ruthie burst through the door with more energy than she'd felt in weeks, the package held high like a trophy. "Mama, Mama, look what I got!" Clara Johnson lay propped against pillows on the narrow bed that dominated their small living space, her dark eyes tracking her daughter's movement with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read joy in the smallest gestures. Despite the fever flush on her cheeks and the way her breathing came in shallow pulls, she managed a smile that lit up her gaunt features. "What you got there, baby girl?" Clara's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried all the warmth and love that had sustained them both through the hardest months of their lives. "Medicine!" Ruthie unwrapped the package with reverent care, displaying the bottles like precious gems. Real medicine from Hoffman's, not just the herb tea from Mrs. Henderson. This is gonna make you better. Mama, I know it is. Clara's eyes widened as she took in the professional labels, the expensive bottles, the careful pharmaceutical preparations that represented more money than they'd seen in months. Her hand moved instinctively to her throat, where a simple gold chain once held the wedding ring she'd pawned 2 weeks ago, the last piece of her marriage to a man who'd promised to love her in sickness and in health before disappearing. At the first sign of real hardship, Ruthie, honey, Clara struggled to sit up straighter, alarm creeping into her voice. Where did you get the money for all this? I didn't steal it, if that's what you're thinking. Ruthie settled on the edge of the bed, her small hands already working to open the first bottle according to the written instructions. Sheriff Dorsey paid for it. He was in the store when Mr. Hoffman said $3 wasn't enough, and he just stepped up and bought everything. Clara stared at her daughter for a long moment, trying to process this unexpected development. In her experience, help from wealthy white men came with strings attached, strings that often tightened around a woman's throat when she least expected it. The absence of her wedding ring felt suddenly heavier, a reminder of promises broken and trust betrayed. Baby, you don't understand how these things work, Clara said gently, accepting the spoonful of laudanum tincture that Ruthie held to her lips. The medicine tasted bitter but expensive, nothing like the folk remedies that were all they'd been able to afford. Men like Sheriff Dorsey, they don't just help people like us out of kindness. There's always something they want in return. Ruthie frowned, not willing to have her moment of triumph clouded by her mama's cynicism. He didn't act like he wanted anything. He just said something about losing his daughter and how the town forgot how to take care of its own. His daughter? Clara's expression shifted, memory stirring behind her fevered eyes. I remember hearing about that years ago now. Little girl who died of fever when Doc Morrison went off to tend soldiers. That was before your time, before we even came to Cedar Creek. The medicine was already beginning to work, or perhaps it was simply the psychological relief of having real medical treatment within reach. Clara's breathing seemed slightly easier, the tight lines around her eyes beginning to soften. She reached out to stroke Ruthie's hair with fingers that shook only slightly. Maybe... Clara paused, considering. Maybe he really was just trying to help. God knows, there's been little enough kindness in this world lately. While mother and daughter shared this quiet moment of hope, Sheriff Silas Dorsey sat in his office 3 blocks away, staring out the window at a town that suddenly looked different to his eyes. The familiar streets and buildings remained the same, but something in his perception had shifted, like adjusting the focus on a telescope and realizing you'd been looking at the wrong things entirely. His deputy, Tom Brennan, watched from the doorway with curiosity and concern. He'd known Silas for 15 years, had seen him handle everything from cattle rustlers to claim jumpers with steady competence. But he'd never seen his boss look quite so unsettled. Something troubling you, Sheriff? Tom ventured, settling into the chair across from Silas's desk. At 45, he was younger than his boss, but old enough to recognize the signs of a man wrestling with uncomfortable thoughts. Tell me something, Tom. Silas turned from the window, his weathered hands clasped behind his back. When's the last time you paid attention to who can afford medicine in this town and who can't? Tom blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected question. I suppose I never really thought about it. Doc Peterson handles the medical side of things. Hoffman runs his business the way he sees fit. Not really our concern, is it? Isn't it? Silas moved to his desk, picking up a stack of reports and setting them down again without reading them. We're supposed to keep the peace, maintain order, protect the citizens. But what does that mean if we only protect the ones who can afford protection? Silas, what's this really about? You've been acting strange since you came back from Hoffman's this afternoon. Silas was quiet for a moment, remembering the weight of Ruthie's small shoulder under his hand, the way she'd looked up at him with such desperate hope. It had been easier to ignore the struggling families when they remained at the edges of his awareness. Easier to focus on cattle thieves and property disputes that didn't require him to confront the uncomfortable realities of who had power and who didn't. There's a little girl in this town who almost watched. Her mama died because $8 might as well have been 800, Silas said finally. And a whole store full of decent people who were willing to let it happen rather than make a fuss. Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair. You can't save everyone, Sheriff. And getting involved in folks' personal troubles, that's a road with no end to it. Maybe. Silas settled heavily into his own chair, suddenly feeling every one of his 60 years. But maybe there's a difference between saving everyone and saving someone. Maybe there's a difference between getting involved in personal troubles and remembering that we're all connected to each other, whether we want to admit it or not. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Mrs. Patterson entered, her usual brisk manner somewhat subdued. She was one of the town's most prominent citizens, her husband owning the largest general store and her opinions carrying considerable social weight. Sheriff Dorsey, I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I wanted to speak with you about this afternoon's incident at the apothecary. Silas gestured to a chair, his expression carefully neutral. What about it, Mrs. Patterson? Well, it's just... She smoothed her skirts nervously, choosing her words with obvious care. People are talking naturally. And while your generosity is admirable, some folks are wondering if it might set a dangerous precedent. If word gets out that you'll pay for anyone's medicine, well, you could find yourself overwhelmed with requests. Would that be such a terrible thing? Silas asked quietly. Mrs. Patterson looked genuinely surprised by the question. Sheriff, you're a successful man, but even your resources have limits. And more importantly, there's a natural order to these things. People need to take responsibility for their own circumstances, not expect others to solve their problems for them. Natural order? Silas repeated the phrase as if tasting something bitter. Is it natural for children to watch their parents die from treatable conditions? Is it natural for medicine to sit on shelves while people suffer because they can't afford relief? That's not what I meant, and you know it. Mrs. Patterson's voice carried a hint of reproach. I'm simply suggesting that charity, while admirable, should be handled through proper channels. The church, the Ladies' Aid Society, established institutions that can evaluate need and distribute help appropriately. Silas thought about Ruthie clutching her 3 crumpled bills, about the quiet desperation in her voice as she'd pleaded for her mama's life. He thought about committees and evaluations and proper channels, and how Sarah might have been saved if compassion hadn't required so much bureaucracy. Maybe the proper channels have forgotten their purpose, he said. By Sunday morning, the story had traveled through Cedar Creek's social networks with the speed and efficiency that only small-town gossip could achieve. It had been embellished and analyzed, praised and criticized, dissected in parlors and debated over breakfast tables until the simple act of buying medicine had taken on the weight of a political statement. Reverend McKinley stood at his pulpit that morning, gazing out over his congregation with the careful expression of a man trying to navigate treacherous waters. The usual faces occupied the usual pews, the Thorntons in their reserved front row, the Carmichaels with their perfectly groomed children, the Pattersons radiating social authority from their customary seats near the aisle. These were the pillars of Cedar Creek society, the people whose donations kept the church running and whose approval determined the acceptability of any new ideas. They were also the people who had stood silent in Hoffman's apothecary while a child begged for her mother's life. Today I want to speak about the Good Samaritan, McKinley began, his voice carrying easily through the wooden sanctuary. A story many of you know well, but perhaps haven't considered recently in light of current events. Sheriff Dorsey sat in the back pew, as was his custom, his weathered hands folded in his lap and his attention focused on the Reverend's words. He'd been attending services here for over 20 years, had buried his wife and daughter in the cemetery behind these walls, but he couldn't remember the last time a sermon had felt personally directed at him. The parable tells us of a man beaten and robbed, left dying on the roadside, McKinley continued. A priest passed by, and then a Levite, both religious men, both pillars of their community. Both chose to cross to the other side of the road rather than involve themselves in a stranger's suffering. Mrs. Patterson shifted uncomfortably in her pew, her silk fan snapping open with unnecessary force. She'd spoken to McKinley before the service, expressing her concerns about the unfortunate precedent being set by certain members of the community, and she'd expected a more supportive message from the pulpit. But then came the Samaritan, an outsider, a man despised by proper society. He didn't debate the appropriateness of helping. He didn't form a committee to evaluate the stranger's worthiness. He didn't worry about setting dangerous precedents. McKinley's eyes found Silas in the back of the church, and for a moment, the two men shared an understanding that transcended words. He simply saw suffering and acted to relieve it. The collection plate made its rounds after the service, as it did every Sunday, passed from pew to pew with the quiet reverence of established tradition. Silas watched the familiar ritual with new eyes, observing how each person's contribution reflected not just their wealth, but their understanding of obligation. The plate itself was tarnished silver, donated years ago by some forgotten benefactor, its surface worn smooth by countless hands and weighted with generations of good intentions. But good intentions, Silas reflected, had not been enough to save his daughter, and they would not be enough to heal the growing divide he was beginning to see in his town. After the service, as the congregation filed out into the bright morning sunlight, conversations resumed in hushed tones that carried the electric undercurrent of controversy. Silas found himself surrounded by a small group of townspeople, their faces reflecting a mixture of curiosity, admiration, and barely concealed disapproval. "Sheriff," Mr. Thornton approached with the measured stride of a man accustomed to being heard. "I wonder if we might have a word about this business with the Johnson child." "What about it?" Silas's tone remained neutral, but his eyes carried a warning that more perceptive observers would have heeded. "Well, it's just that some of us are concerned about the implications. If every unfortunate family in the territory learns they can come to Cedar Creek and expect charity from our sheriff." Thornton let the sentence hang, confident that Silas would understand the larger concerns. "Are you worried they might actually receive help?" Silas asked quietly. Thornton blinked, clearly not expecting such a direct challenge. "I'm worried about the stability of our community, the precedent we set, the idea that people might expect compassion from their neighbors." Silas interrupted. "The dangerous notion that wealth might come with responsibility." "That's not what I meant." Thornton's voice carried the frustrated tone of a man unused to having his authority questioned. "I'm talking about practical considerations, order, proper channels, the way things have always been done." Silas looked around the group that had gathered, reading the mixture of support and opposition in their faces. Some nodded along with Thornton's concerns. Others seemed uncertain, and a few, like Doc Peterson, who stood at the edge of the crowd, watched with obvious approval. "The way things have always been done," Silas repeated slowly. "You mean the way that lets children watch their parents die while medicine sits unused because the price is too high? The way that lets us all go to church on Sunday and sing about loving our neighbors while we ignore their suffering Monday through Saturday?" Mrs. Carmichael gasped softly at the edge of the group, her gloved hand pressed to her chest as if Silas had committed some unforgivable breach of etiquette. "Sheriff Dorsey, surely you're not suggesting that we ignore the proper order of society?" "I'm suggesting that maybe the proper order of society is wrong," Silas said, his voice carrying across the churchyard with quiet authority. "I'm suggesting that any order that values money over human life, that puts social comfort ahead of basic decency, might be an order worth changing." The words fell into the morning air like stones dropped into still water, creating ripples that spread outward through the assembled crowd. Some faces showed shock, others approval, and a few reflected the kind of thoughtful consideration that suggested minds beginning to change. Doc Peterson stepped forward then, his black medical bag in hand, the same bag that had been powerless to save Sarah Dorsey all those years ago. "Sheriff's got a point," he said in his quiet, measured way. I've seen too many people suffer because they couldn't afford treatment. Too many children like little Sarah who might have lived if medicine hadn't been reserved for those who could pay full price. The mention of Silas's daughter created a moment of uncomfortable silence, as if the crowd suddenly realized they were treading on sacred ground. Everyone remembered the tragedy, remembered the young family destroyed by circumstances beyond their control, remembered the way Silas had withdrawn from social life afterward. That was different, Mrs. Patterson said finally, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. That was a tragedy, but it doesn't mean we should abandon all sense of proper procedure, doesn't it? Silas asked, his steel-grey eyes fixed on her face. When proper procedure becomes an excuse for letting people suffer, when it becomes a barrier to helping those in need, what exactly is proper about it? As the crowd began to disperse, people walking away in small groups with their heads bent together in intense conversation, Silas remained on the church steps with Doc Peterson. The two men had known each other for decades, had shared the particular bond that forms between those who have witnessed too much suffering and too little justice. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," Peterson observed, adjusting his grip on his medical bag. "You ready for what comes next?" Silas looked out over his town, his responsibility, his home, his burden, and thought about Ruthie Johnson carefully measuring medicine for her mother, about the hope that had flickered in a child's eyes when someone finally listened to her plea. He thought about Sarah, about all the children who had been failed by systems that prioritized order over compassion. "I've been ready for 20 years, he said. "I just didn't know it until yesterday." Clara Johnson's improvement came in small increments that felt like miracles to those who loved her. The deep, rattling cough that had plagued her nights began to ease, allowing both mother and daughter to sleep for longer stretches without interruption. The fevered flush in her cheeks faded to a more natural color, and her breathing, while still labored, no longer sounded like the desperate gasping of someone drowning on dry land. Ruthie noticed every change with the fierce attention of a child who had learned to read hope in the smallest signs. When her mama managed to sit up long enough to braid Ruthie's hair without resting, it felt like a victory worth celebrating. When Clara could walk to the window and look out at their small garden without needing to lean against the wall for support, Ruthie danced around the cabin with joy that seemed to light up their cramped quarters. "Look at you, dancing like your feet got springs," Clara said with the first genuine laugh Ruthie had heard in months. Her voice was still weak, but it carried warmth and something that had been missing for too long, genuine hope. "You're getting better." "Mama, I can see it." Ruthie settled beside her mother on the bed, careful not to jostle her too much, but needing the comfort of closeness. "Sheriff Dorsey's medicine is working just like he said it would." Clara's expression grew more serious at the mention of their unexpected benefactor. Word had reached even their isolated cabin about the controversies swirling through town, about the arguments in church and the heated discussions in parlors where she would never be welcome. Some folks, she'd heard, were calling the sheriff a saint. Others were using words less flattering. "Ruthie, I need you to understand something about what Sheriff Dorsey did for us," Clara said, stroking her daughter's hair with fingers that were steadier than they'd been in weeks. "It was a good thing, a kind thing, but it's caused trouble for him. Some people in this town don't like seeing the natural order disrupted." "What natural order?" Ruthie asked, though the careful way her mother spoke the words suggested she already understood more than she wanted to. "The order that says some people matter more than others," Clara said quietly. "The order that says people like us should be grateful for whatever scraps we get, and never expect to sit at the same table as our betters." Ruthie frowned, her 9-year-old sense of justice struggling with concepts that seemed fundamentally wrong. "But that's not fair. If Sheriff Dorsey has money for medicine and someone needs medicine, why shouldn't he share it?" "Because sharing means admitting we're all equally deserving of help, baby girl. And that idea scares some folks more than you can imagine." While this conversation unfolded in their small cabin, Silas sat in his office reviewing documents that had been gathering dust in his filing cabinet for nearly 2 decades. The property deed for the old Dorsey family medical clinic lay spread across his desk, its formal language describing a building that had once represented hope for the entire community. His father, Judge Robert Dorsey, had established the clinic in 1855 with the idealistic belief that medical care should be available to anyone who needed it, regardless of their ability to pay. For 15 years, the clinic had served everyone from cattle barons to freed slaves, from prosperous merchants to struggling homesteaders. The only requirement for treatment had been genuine need. The clinic had closed permanently after Sarah's death, when Silas's grief made it impossible to maintain his father's vision of universal compassion. He told himself it was a practical decision. The building needed repairs. The operating costs were substantial. The community had grown and could support private practices like Hoffman's. But looking at the deed now, he recognized the truth he'd been avoiding. For 20 years, he'd closed the clinic because watching other children receive the care that hadn't saved his daughter felt like a betrayal of Sarah's memory. The irony wasn't lost on him that his attempt to honor his daughter's death had effectively guaranteed that other children would face the same fate. The cycle of loss and abandonment that had claimed Sarah was still turning, still destroying families, still leaving children like Ruthie to beg for scraps of mercy from those who had more than enough to share. A knock at his office door interrupted his brooding. Mayor Franklin entered without waiting for permission, his usually florid face tight with concern and barely controlled irritation. "Silas, we need to talk." Franklin settled his considerable bulk into the chair across from the sheriff's desk, mopping his brow with a handkerchief despite the cool morning air. "This situation with the Johnson family has gotten out of hand, has it?" Silas leaned back in his chair, his expression neutral but his eyes watchful. "How so?" "Don't play dumb with me. You know exactly what I'm talking about." Franklin's voice carried the frustrated tone of a politician who'd spent the week managing angry constituents. "Half the town is calling you a hero. The other half thinks you've lost your mind, and everyone's got an opinion about what it means for the future of Cedar Creek. Maybe it's time Cedar Creek had some opinions about its future," Silas said calmly. Franklin's eyes narrowed. "Silas, I've known you for 15 years. You're not a revolutionary, you're not a social reformer, and you're sure as hell not the kind of man who upends established order because of one sob story. Maybe I'm not the man I used to be, or maybe you're having some kind of crisis that's affecting your judgment." Franklin leaned forward, his voice taking on the coaxing tone he might use with a skittish horse. "Look, what you did for the Johnson family was generous, even admirable. But people are starting to talk about larger implications, about systematic changes, about reopening that old clinic of your father's." Silas's hand moved instinctively to the property deed on his desk, a gesture that didn't escape Franklin's notice. "Tell me you're not seriously considering that," Franklin continued. "Tell me you understand what a disaster that would be for this community. How would providing medical care to people who need it be a disaster? Because it would undermine every private practice in town, destroy the natural incentives that keep people working and striving to better themselves, and create a dependency that would bankrupt the county." Franklin's argument came out with the polished fluency of someone who had rehearsed it extensively. More importantly, it would signal that we're willing to abandon the principles that built this community. What principles are those exactly? Silas's voice remained calm, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. The principle that medical care should only be available to those who can afford it? The principle that children should watch their parents die rather than disrupt our social order? The principle of individual responsibility, Franklin shot back. The principle that people should take care of their own problems instead of expecting others to solve them. The principle that charity should be voluntary, not coerced through social pressure or guilt. And if voluntary charity isn't enough, if good intentions and church collection plates don't actually prevent suffering, Franklin stood abruptly, his patience clearly exhausted. Then people suffer, Silas. That's how the world works. That's how it's always worked. You can't save everyone, and trying to do so just creates more problems than you solve. After Franklin left, slamming the door with enough force to rattle the windows, Silas sat alone with the property deed and the weight of 20 years' worth of regrets. Through his office window, he could see Cedar Creek going about its daily business, merchants opening their stores, children walking to school, citizens conducting the ordinary business of life in a community that functioned, more or less according to established patterns. But now he could also see what he'd been blind to before. The subtle divisions, the quiet exclusions, the way prosperity created barriers that kept some people forever on the outside looking in. He saw Mrs. Henderson hanging laundry on a line strung between two posts because she couldn't afford proper clotheslines. He saw Tommy Walsh's younger brother collecting scraps behind the bakery because his family couldn't afford fresh bread. He saw the careful way certain families avoided Main Street during business hours, as if their presence might somehow contaminate the commercial heart of the community. Most of all, he saw Sarah, not as she had been in life, but as she might have been if his father's clinic had still been operating when fever struck their home. He saw a different version of that terrible week, one where medical care had been available without question or delay, where a little girl's life hadn't depended on her father's ability to pay for treatment. The property deed felt heavier in his hands than paper had any right to feel, weighted with possibility and responsibility in equal measure. Reopening the clinic would be more than a gesture of charity. It would be a declaration that Cedar Creek was ready to become something better than what it had always been. The question was whether he had the courage to make that declaration, and whether his community would follow him into an uncertain future or choose the familiar comfort of injustice they'd already learned to live with. The old clinic building stood at the corner of Oak and 2nd Street, like a monument to abandoned good intentions. Its windows were boarded up with weathered planks, its front door secured with a chain that had rusted to the color of dried blood, and weeds grew tall enough around its foundation to hide the original cornerstone that bore Judge Robert Dorsey's engraved dedication, "For all who suffer, without regard to station or circumstance." Silas stood before the building on Thursday morning, a ring of heavy keys in one hand and a leather satchel in the other. The satchel contained his father's medical instruments, a stethoscope, surgical tools, measuring devices, all carefully maintained despite 20 years of disuse, as if some part of him had always known this day would come. The lock resisted at first, corroded by years of neglect, but finally yielded to his persistent effort. The door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo through the empty street, revealing an interior thick with dust and shadow. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the boarded windows, creating patterns on the floor that looked like prison bars. Despite the accumulation of abandonment, the bones of the clinic remained sound. The main examining room still held its sturdy oak table, built to last by craftsmen who understood that medical furniture needed to endure decades of hard use. The medicine cabinets lined one wall with military precision, their glass fronts clouded but unbroken. The smaller rooms that had once served as private consultation spaces waited in patient silence, ready to resume their purpose if someone had the will to give them new life. "Figured I might find you here." Silas turned to find Doc Peterson standing in the doorway, his own medical bag in hand, and his weathered face wearing an expression of cautious optimism. The two men had known each other for decades, had shared the particular bond that forms between those who have witnessed too much suffering and too little justice. "Word travels fast," Silas observed, setting his father's satchel on the examining table and running his hand along its scarred surface. "Word travels faster when it carries hope," Peterson replied, stepping into the dusty interior and looking around with the practiced eye of someone evaluating possibilities rather than obstacles. especially hope that people have been waiting 20 years to see. Peterson moved to the medicine cabinets, testing their latches and examining their construction with professional interest. Your father built this place to last. Good solid infrastructure, proper ventilation, room for expansion. With some cleaning and restocking, we could have patients by the end of the month.
Silas raised an eyebrow.
Though he couldn't hide his relief at the prospect of not facing this challenge alone. You didn't think I'd let you attempt something this ambitious without proper medical supervision, did you? Peterson's smile carried genuine warmth. Besides, I've been wanting to practice real medicine instead of just treating whoever can afford my rates. This town needs a place where medical decisions are based on need instead of ability to pay. They worked through the morning in comfortable silence, taking inventory of what could be salvaged and what would need replacing. The building revealed itself gradually, like an archaeological site where each cleaned surface exposed another layer of forgotten purpose. Silas found himself remembering afternoons spent here as a child, watching his father treat everyone from prosperous ranchers to desperate homesteaders with the same careful attention and gentle dignity. By midday, word of their activities had spread through Cedar Creek's efficient gossip network. People began gathering on the sidewalk across the street, some watching with curiosity, others with obvious disapproval, all trying to gauge the implications of what they were witnessing. Mrs. Patterson arrived first, her usual brisk confidence somewhat subdued as she approached the clinic's open doorway. Behind her came several other prominent citizens, their faces reflecting various degrees of concern and calculation. Sheriff Dorsey, Mrs. Patterson began, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone walking through a verbal minefield. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion, but naturally people are curious about your intentions regarding this property. Silas emerged from the interior, dust coating his clothes and cobwebs clinging to his hair, but his expression calm and resolute. I'm reopening the clinic, making it available to anyone who needs medical care, regardless of their ability to pay. I see. Mrs. Patterson's lips pressed into a thin line. And have you considered the impact this might have on established medical practices in town? On the economy? On the social order that has served Cedar Creek well for many years? I've considered that the social order you're defending killed my daughter and nearly killed Clara Johnson, Silas replied quietly. I've considered that any order that values money over human life might not be worth preserving. Mr. Thornton stepped forward, his banker's instincts clearly troubled by the financial implications. Sheriff, you're talking about providing free medical care to anyone who asks for it. Do you have any idea what that would cost? How do you plan to fund such an operation? Silas thought about the cattle ranch that had made him wealthy, about the investments that had grown over 20 years of careful management, about the money that had accumulated while he'd grieved instead of living. I'll find a way. What about the precedent? Mrs. Carmichael interjected, her voice rising with genuine alarm. If word spreads that Cedar Creek provides free medical care, we'll be overrun with indigents and transients. Our community will become a magnet for every unfortunate person in the territory. Would that be such a terrible thing? Peterson asked from the doorway, his medical bag still in hand and his expression thoughtful. To become known as a place where suffering people can find help? The crowd that had gathered began to murmur among themselves, voices carrying fragments of argument and concern. Some faces showed support, others clear opposition, and many reflected the uncertain middle ground of people trying to decide which side of history they wanted to claim. Into this tense atmosphere walked Ruthie Johnson, her small figure somehow commanding attention despite her size and station. She moved through the adult crowd with the unself-conscious dignity of a child who had learned to navigate hostile territory, her dark eyes taking in the scene with careful assessment. Sheriff Dorsey? Her clear voice cut through the adult conversations like a knife through cloth. Is it true what folks are saying? That you're fixing up this place to help people like my mama? The question hung in the morning air, simple and direct in a way that made the adults' complicated arguments seem suddenly petty and self-serving. Silas looked down at this child who had inadvertently set all these changes in motion, and saw in her face the same desperate hope that had moved him to action days earlier. "Yes," he said simply, "that's exactly what I'm doing." Ruthie's smile could have powered the entire town, bright and fierce and full of possibility. "Mama's going to be so happy. She's been worrying about what would happen when the medicine runs out, about how we'd pay for more. Now she won't have to worry anymore." Mrs. Patterson's expression softened slightly at this display of childish joy, but her voice remained firm. "Sheriff, surely you understand that good intentions aren't enough. Running a medical facility requires more than wishful thinking and charitable impulses." "You're right," Silas acknowledged. "It requires commitment, resources, and community support. It requires people willing to believe that healing is more important than profit, that compassion is more valuable than social order." He looked around the gathered crowd, reading the mixture of hope and fear in their faces, understanding that this moment would define not just his own future, but the character of Cedar Creek itself. It requires us to become the kind of community that takes care of its own, instead of the kind that lets children beg for their parents' lives. The words settled over the crowd, like dust after an explosion, and in the silence that followed, everyone present understood that something fundamental had shifted in their small town. The only question now was whether that shift would lead to healing or further division. The letter had been tucked inside his father's medical journal for over 20 years, its edges yellow with age, and its careful script faded to the color of old tea. Silas discovered it while reviewing his father's notes about running a charity clinic, searching for practical guidance about managing supplies and patient records. The envelope bore his father's handwriting. For Silas, when he's ready to understand the weight of mercy, he'd been ready for answers about clinical procedures and budgetary concerns. He wasn't ready for the truth about Clara Johnson. The letter, dated 3 months before Judge Robert Dorsey's death, began with the formal language of legal documentation, but quickly shifted to the intimate tone of a father confessing to his son. Silas read it twice before the full implication settled into his consciousness, like stones dropping to the bottom of a deep well. "My dear son, if you are reading this, then you have likely decided to reopen the clinic and resume the work I began. Before you do, there are truths you must know about our family's obligations, debts of honor that extend beyond simple charity. Clara May Washington was born in our home in 1858, delivered by my own hands when her mother, Lily, served as wet nurse to your sister Margaret. Lily Washington was a woman of extraordinary character who came to us as a freed slave from Virginia, seeking work and safety for herself and her unborn child. She found both in our household and more. She found a family that valued her contributions and respected her humanity. When yellow fever struck the territory in 1859, Lily insisted on helping me treat the afflicted, despite the obvious danger to herself and her infant daughter. She said that healing was a calling that transcended color, that suffering recognized no social boundaries. She saved dozens of lives through her knowledge of herbal remedies and her fearless nursing care. She saved your life specifically when you contracted the fever at age 7. Lily Washington died protecting this community, son. She contracted the disease while tending to the Carmichael family during their crisis, and she died knowing that her sacrifice had helped contain an epidemic that could have destroyed Cedar Creek entirely. In her final hours, she made me promise that her daughter would always have a place in our community, that Clara would never want for medical care or basic necessities. I have honored that promise for 20 years, supporting Clara's education and well-being through discreet channels, anonymous donations to her schooling, medical care when needed, employment opportunities arranged through trusted intermediaries. When she married Thomas Johnson and moved to the edge of town, I continued to watch over her welfare from a distance, believing that invisible assistance preserved her dignity better than obvious charity. I failed to anticipate that Thomas would abandon his family when hardship struck. or that Clara's pride would prevent her from seeking help directly from those she believed had no connection to her past. I failed to foresee that my death would sever the support network I had carefully maintained, leaving Clara and her daughter vulnerable to the very circumstances that my clinic was designed to prevent. If Clara is in need, if she is suffering while medicine sits unused and charity remains unadministered, then our family has failed in its most sacred obligation. We owe her more than kindness, son. We owe her justice, and the community owes her the debt that comes with being saved by her mother's sacrifice. Reopen the clinic not just as an act of charity, but as an act of restitution. Make it a monument to Lily Washington's legacy, a place where healing recognizes no barriers and human worth transcends social station. Make it the fulfillment of promises made to a dying woman who gave everything to protect a community that has largely forgotten her name. The letter continued with specific details about Lily Washington's contributions, her medical knowledge, her role in establishing the original clinic's patient care protocols. It described a woman of remarkable intelligence and compassion who had shaped the very foundations of medical care in Cedar Creek, whose innovations had been quietly incorporated into standard practice without acknowledgement of their source. Silas sat in the dusty clinic, his father's letter trembling in his hands, and felt the familiar sensation of discovering that everything he thought he knew about his life was incomplete. Clara Johnson wasn't just another struggling mother who had touched his conscience. She was family in every way that mattered. She was the daughter of the woman who had saved his life, the inheritor of a legacy that his family had pledged to honor and protect. The realization recontextualized everything. His immediate response to Ruthie's plea, the intensity of his emotional connection to their struggle, the way Clara's dignity and strength had reminded him of something he couldn't quite name. He'd been drawn to help them not just by compassion, but by the unconscious recognition of a debt that went deeper than charity, older than conscious memory. More troubling was the understanding that Clara had been struggling in poverty while resources existed to help her, resources that should have been available automatically, without the dramatic intervention that had shocked the community. The systems his father had established to support her had died with him, victims of the same grief and withdrawal that had led Silas to close the clinic and abandon his family's commitments. The sound of footsteps on the clinic's front porch interrupted his brooding. Clara Johnson appeared in the doorway, moving slowly but under her own power. Her color improved and her breathing less labored than it had been in months. Ruthie walked beside her, protective and proud, ready to catch her mama if she stumbled, but clearly delighted to see her up and moving. "Sheriff Dorsey?" Clara's voice was still weak, but it carried the musical quality that Silas now recognized as an echo of her mother's remembered tones. "Ruthie told me you were working on fixing up this place. I wanted to come thank you proper for what you did, and to see if there's any way I can help." Silas looked at this woman, this daughter of the woman who had saved his life, and felt 20 years of incomplete understanding suddenly click into focus. Clara had her mother's eyes, the same intelligent compassion that had made Lily Washington such an effective healer. She had the same quiet dignity that refused to be diminished by circumstances, the same strength that had enabled her mother to risk everything for a community that had never fully acknowledged her contributions. "Clara," Silas said slowly, the letter still clutched in his hand, "there's something I need to tell you, something about your mother and my family, and promises that should have been kept." Clara's expression grew cautious, as if she sensed that whatever revelation was coming would change the nature of their relationship permanently. "What kind of promises?" Silas held out the letter, watching her face as she read the words that rewrote both their histories. Her eyes widened as the implications became clear, her free hand moving to cover her mouth in a gesture of shock and recognition. "Mama always said she'd worked for a good family," Clara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "She said they treated her with respect, valued her contributions, made her feel like she belonged somewhere. She never told me it was your family. She never told me about the promises. She probably wanted you to make your own way in the world without feeling beholden to anyone, Silas said gently. Your mother was proud, and she understood that dignity sometimes requires independence. Ruthie looked back and forth between the two adults, sensing the significance of what was happening, even if she couldn't grasp all the details. What does this mean, Mama? What does it mean for us? Clara was quiet for a long moment, her eyes still focused on the letter that revealed connections spanning generations. When she finally looked up at Silas, her expression carried a mixture of gratitude, understanding, and something that might have been relief. It means, Clara said carefully, that when you helped us, you weren't just being kind to strangers. You were honoring a debt that your family owed to mine. It means that my mama's sacrifices weren't forgotten, even when it seemed like they had been. She paused, looking around the dusty clinic with new eyes, seeing it not just as a place where medical care might be available, but as a monument to her mother's legacy, a fulfillment of promises made across the boundaries of race and class and time. And it means, Clara continued, her voice growing stronger, that reopening this clinic isn't just about charity or social reform. It's about justice. It's about honoring the people who built this community's foundations, even when their contributions were never properly recognized. Silas nodded, understanding that this revelation had transformed their relationship from benefactor and recipient to something more complex and meaningful, partners in fulfilling a legacy that belonged to both their families, inheritors of a promise that transcended individual acts of kindness. The plot had twisted, revealing connections that made their struggle personal, historical, and inevitably more dangerous. Because if the community had been resistant to simple charity, they would be even more threatened by the idea of justice, especially justice that challenged their comfortable assumptions about who had built their prosperity and who deserved to share in its benefits. But for the first time since Sarah's death, Silas felt that he was fighting for something larger than individual conscience. He was fighting to honor the sacrifices of a woman whose legacy had shaped his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. The revelation about Clara's connection to the Dorsey family spread through Cedar Creek with the inexorable force of floodwater, seeping into every conversation and reshaping every assumption. Within hours of Clara's visit to the clinic, the story had been dissected, analyzed, and debated in parlors and saloons, barbershops and church halls, until the simple act of providing medical care had become entangled with complex questions of historical debt, racial justice, and the true foundations of community prosperity. Some residents responded with shame, recognizing that they had allowed the daughter of Cedar Creek's forgotten heroine to struggle in poverty while they debated the propriety of helping her. Others reacted with defensive anger, arguing that past debts didn't justify present disruptions to social order. Still others seemed relieved to have a concrete reason for Silas's actions, as if family obligation was more acceptable than universal compassion. But the revelation also brought unexpected allies out of their cautious silence. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly widow whose small cabin neighbored Clara's, arrived at the clinic on Friday morning carrying a leather-bound notebook wrapped in oilcloth. Her weathered face bore the determined expression of someone who had decided to bear witness, regardless of personal cost. "Sheriff Dorsey," she said without preamble, placing the package on the examining table with reverent care. "This belonged to Lily Washington. She gave it to me the night she died, made me promise to keep it safe until someone came along who would understand its value." Silas unwrapped the notebook with hands that trembled slightly, revealing pages covered with careful script in faded brown ink. The writing documented herbal remedies, treatment protocols, patient observations, a comprehensive medical guide compiled by someone with deep practical knowledge and sharp analytical intelligence. Notes in the margins revealed innovations in patient care that had later been adopted as standard practice throughout the territory. "She was a real doctor," Clara whispered, reading over Silas's shoulder. Not trained in schools, maybe, but she understood healing better than most who carried official credentials. She understood more than healing, Mrs. Henderson said firmly. She understood that medicine was about serving people, not serving profit. She understood that a healer's obligation was to whoever suffered, not whoever could pay. Doc Peterson arrived while they were still examining the notebook, his medical bag in hand and his expression purposeful. Behind him came Tommy Walsh, the young clerk from Hoffman's apothecary, carrying supplies that he clearly hadn't purchased through normal channels. "Mr. Hoffman's gone to Denver on business," Tommy explained nervously, setting down bottles of medicine and surgical supplies. "Won't be back till Monday. Figured what he don't know won't hurt him, and folks need these things more than his shelves do." The morning passed in focused preparation. As more unexpected supporters appeared, Mrs. Miller brought clean linens that she'd been saving for special occasions. The blacksmith, Jake Morrison, appeared with tools and hardware to repair the clinic's front door and install proper locks. Even Reverend McKinley arrived, carrying his wife's medical knowledge and her collection of healing herbs. By noon, the clinic was beginning to look functional rather than abandoned. The examining table had been scrubbed clean, the medicine cabinets restocked, the floors swept clear of 20 years' worth of dust and neglect. Lily Washington's notebook had been placed in a position of honor beside Judge Dorsey's medical instruments, creating a visual symbol of the partnership between formal training and practical wisdom that would guide the clinic's work. But the opposition was organizing as well. Mayor Franklin returned in the early afternoon, this time accompanied by a delegation that included the town's most prominent citizens. Mr. Thornton carried a folder of legal documents. Mrs. Patterson bore a petition signed by what appeared to be dozens of residents, and behind them stood several men whose presence suggested that not all resistance would remain purely verbal. "Sheriff Dorsey," Franklin began, his voice carrying the formal tone of official business. "I'm here to inform you that the town council has voted to revoke the operating license for this facility. Health and safety concerns, you understand, plus questions about proper medical supervision and liability for treatment outcomes." Silas straightened from the supply cabinet he'd been organizing, his expression calm, but his eyes alert to the subtle threat represented by the men positioned near the doorway. "What health and safety concerns?" "The building has been abandoned for 20 years, Thornton interjected, consulting his documents with bureaucratic precision. "No recent inspections, questionable structural integrity, potential contamination from years of neglect. The town can't accept liability for medical treatment provided in such conditions." "Interesting," Doc Peterson observed mildly from the corner where he'd been testing surgical instruments. "I don't recall similar concerns being raised about other medical facilities in town. Has Hoffman's apothecary undergone recent inspection?" "What about my own practice?" Mrs. Patterson stepped forward with her petition, her voice carrying the righteous certainty of someone convinced of her moral superiority. "Beyond the safety issues, Sheriff, this petition represents the concerns of 37 responsible citizens who believe this clinic would attract undesirable elements to our community. Vagrants, transients, people looking for something for nothing, people looking for medical care when they're sick." Clara asked quietly from beside the examining table. Her improvement over the past weeks had been remarkable, but her voice still carried the careful control of someone managing limited strength. "People like me and my daughter?" "That's different," Mrs. Patterson said quickly, though her discomfort was obvious. "You're part of our community. You have historical connections that create special circumstances. What makes me part of the community?" Clara pressed, her tone remaining gentle, but her questions cutting to the heart of uncomfortable truths. "The fact that my mother saved this town from epidemic. The fact that she died protecting people who never acknowledged her sacrifice. Or the fact that I'm light-skinned enough to pass for respectable." The silence that followed was electric with tension, pregnant with implications that no one wanted to address directly. Mrs. Patterson's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, her petition suddenly seeming less like a moral crusade and more like a defense of privilege. "The point is," Franklin said loudly, trying to regain control of the situation, "that operating this facility without proper authorization is illegal. The town council has authority over all medical facilities within city limits, and we're prepared to enforce that authority if necessary." The men near the doorway shifted slightly, their hands moving to rest on gun belts in a gesture that was meant to appear casual, but carried obvious menace. Silas recognized the type, men who had learned to use violence as a tool of social control, who understood that legal authority often came down to who was willing to use force and who was willing to back down. "I see," Silas said calmly, his own hand moving with practiced casualness to rest on his pistol grip. 20 years of law enforcement had taught him to read dangerous situations, and this one was escalating toward violence with the predictable inevitability of a thunderstorm building on the horizon. "Sheriff," Tommy Walsh spoke up from beside the medicine cabinet, his young voice cracking with nervous energy. "You got legal authority to keep the peace in this town, don't you? That includes protecting people who are trying to help other people." Franklin's eyes narrowed as he recognized the implication. If this situation devolved into violence, Silas wouldn't just be defending a clinic, he'd be acting in his official capacity as a law enforcement officer. The legal and political complications of that scenario would extend far beyond Cedar Creek's borders, potentially bringing territorial and federal attention to their local disputes. "Nobody wants trouble here," Franklin said carefully. "We're all reasonable people who can work out our differences through proper channels." "What proper channels?" Clara asked, still standing beside the examining table where she'd first found hope for her mother's legacy. "The same proper channels that left me to watch my daughter beg for medicine while surrounded by people who owed their lives to my mother's sacrifice." Ruthie appeared in the doorway then, her small figure somehow commanding attention despite the crowd of adults filling the clinic. She'd been helping Mrs. Henderson organize medical supplies in the back room, but the raised voices had clearly drawn her forward to see what was happening. "Sheriff Franklin," she said, with the serious formality of a child who understood that adult conversations sometimes determined her future. "Are you trying to stop Sheriff Dorsey from helping sick people?" Franklin's face flushed as he found himself in the uncomfortable position of explaining to a 9-year-old why providing medical care might be inappropriate. "It's not that simple, child. There are rules, procedures, legal requirements." "My mama was dying," Ruthie interrupted, her clear voice cutting through adult complications with devastating simplicity. "She was dying, and you're worried about rules." The words hung in the clinic's dusty air like an accusation that no amount of legal language could adequately answer. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing more than a bureaucratic dispute. They were seeing a community forced to confront the moral consequences of its social order, to choose between comfortable traditions and uncomfortable justice. Silas looked around the room, taking in the faces of his neighbors and fellow citizens, reading the mixture of fear, hope, anger, and calculation in their expressions. Some were ready to support change, others determined to prevent it, and many caught in the uncertain middle ground of people who understood that whatever happened next would define Cedar Creek's character for generations to come. The afternoon sun slanted through the clinic's windows, casting long shadows that seemed to divide the room between those who stood in light and those who remained in darkness. Outside, more people were gathering. Word had spread that something significant was happening at the old clinic, and the entire community was converging to witness the outcome. In a few moments, choices would be made that couldn't be unmade. People would have to decide whether they valued order over justice, tradition over compassion, social comfort over human dignity. The climax was building like pressure in a steam engine, and everyone present could feel the approaching moment when something would have to give way. The moment of decision crystallized when Mayor Franklin pulled a folded document from his coat pocket, his face set in the grim expression of a man who had decided that negotiation was no longer possible. "Sheriff Dorsey," Franklin announced loudly enough for everyone present to hear clearly, "by the authority vested in the Cedar Creek Town Council, I hereby serve you with an official cease and desist order. You will immediately discontinue all medical operations on these premises and surrender the keys to this building to municipal custody." Silas took the document without reading it, his weathered hands steady despite the magnitude of what was being demanded. Around him, the clinic fell silent except for the sound of breathing and the subtle creaking of floorboards as people shifted their weight. Outside, the crowd that had gathered pressed closer to the windows, trying to see and hear what was happening inside. "And if I refuse?" Silas asked quietly, his voice carrying no anger but absolute resolve. "Then you'll be in violation of municipal ordinances and subject to removal from office," Franklin replied, though his tone suggested he took no pleasure in the threat. "The town council has the authority to suspend any official who refuses to comply with lawful orders." Doc Peterson stepped forward then, his medical bag still in hand and his expression thoughtful. "Mayor Franklin, might I ask who exactly complained about health and safety violations at this facility? Because as the only licensed physician currently practicing in Cedar Creek, I can certify that this building meets or exceeds the standards maintained by every other medical facility in town." Franklin's discomfort was obvious, as he found himself forced to reveal the political nature of his legal maneuvering. The complaints came from concerned citizens who worry about the implications of unlicensed medical practice. "Unlicensed?" Peterson raised an eyebrow. "I'm licensed to practice medicine anywhere in the territory. If I choose to provide services at this facility, what license do I lack?" "It's not about medical licenses," Mrs. Patterson interjected, her patience clearly exhausted by what she saw as unnecessary legal complications. "It's about the precedent this sets, about the message we send to every indigent person within 100 miles. If Cedar Creek becomes known as a place where anyone can receive free medical care, we'll be overwhelmed with people looking for handouts." Clara Johnson looked up from Lily Washington's medical notebook, her dark eyes reflecting both sadness and determination. "Mrs. Patterson, what message do you think we send when we let children watch their parents die rather than disrupt our social order? What precedent do we set when we value money more than human life?" "That's not what this is about," Mrs. Patterson protested, though her voice lacked conviction. "This is about maintaining proper procedures, ensuring quality care, protecting the community from what?" Ruthie's clear voice cut through the adult complications like a knife through cloth. She stood beside her mother, small but fearless, her 9-year-old perspective reducing complex arguments to their essential truth. "From helping people who need help?" The simple question echoed through the clinic, exposing the inadequacy of elaborate justifications for abandoning fundamental human decency. Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, recognizing that they were being asked to defend the indefensible. Silas looked down at the cease and desist order in his hands, then at the sheriff's badge pinned to his vest. The badge had been his identity for 2 decades, the symbol of his authority and his commitment to protecting his community. But what did protection mean if it only extended to those wealthy enough to purchase safety? What did justice mean if it could be purchased and denied based on social status? He thought about Sarah, about the night she died while medicine sat unused because proper channels had failed to deliver help when it was needed. He thought about Lily Washington, whose sacrifice had saved his life, and countless others whose contributions had been forgotten by the community she died protecting. He thought about Clara and Ruthie, about the desperation that had driven a child to beg for her mother's life while adults debated procedures and precedents. "Tom," Silas said quietly to his deputy, who had been watching from the corner with obvious internal conflict, "you've been a good deputy for 15 years. You understand law and order, procedure and protocol. Tell me, what does the law say about letting people die while help is available?" Deputy Brennan looked around the room, reading the faces of his neighbors and fellow citizens. understanding that his answer would define not just his professional relationship with Silas, but his own moral position in a community being forced to confront its values. The law says we're supposed to protect and serve, Brennan replied slowly. All the people, not just the ones who can afford protection and service. Franklin's face darkened as he recognized that even official support for his position was crumbling. Deputy Brennan, you're employed by the town council. Your loyalty should be to the municipal authority, not to individual interpretations of duty. My loyalty, Brennan said firmly, is to justice. And justice doesn't stop at the edge of someone's wallet. Silas felt the weight of his badge differently now, not as a symbol of institutional authority, but as a reminder that real law enforcement meant protecting the vulnerable from the powerful, not the other way around. He unpinned the badge slowly, holding it up so everyone present could see the decision he was making. If maintaining order means abandoning justice, then I choose justice, Silas announced, his voice carrying clearly through the clinic and out to the crowd beyond. If protecting the community means sacrificing its most vulnerable members, then the community needs new protection. The badge caught the afternoon sunlight as he set it carefully on the examining table beside Lily Washington's notebook and his father's medical instruments. The gesture was simple but unmistakable. He was choosing conscience over career, moral obligation over social pressure, human need over institutional authority. You're making a mistake, Silas, Franklin warned, though his tone suggested more sadness than anger. You're throwing away 20 years of service for what? A gesture, a symbol? This won't solve the bigger problems, won't change the way the world works. Maybe not, Silas acknowledged, looking around the room at faces that reflected hope, fear, admiration, and disapproval in equal measure. But it might change the way Cedar Creek works. It might remind us that communities are supposed to take care of their own, not sort them into worthy and unworthy categories. Outside, the crowd pressed closer to the windows, sensing that something momentous was happening, that their community was being transformed by forces beyond their control or complete understanding. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the clinic, dividing the space between those who stood for change and those who stood for tradition, between those who prioritized compassion and those who prioritized order. The confrontation had reached its peak, but the resolution remained uncertain. Would the community follow Silas into an uncertain future, guided by justice and compassion? Or would they choose the familiar comfort of inequality they'd learned to accept as natural and inevitable? The silence that followed Silas's renunciation of his badge stretched through the clinic like a held breath, pregnant with possibilities that could reshape Cedar Creek's future or restore its comfortable past. Everyone present understood that this was more than a bureaucratic dispute. It was a moral reckoning that would define their community's character for generations to come. Then Mrs. Henderson stepped forward from the corner where she'd been watching quietly, her weathered face set in lines of quiet determination. Despite her advanced age and modest circumstances, her voice carried clearly through the tense atmosphere. "I was there the night Lily Washington died," she announced, her words falling into the silence like stones dropped into still water. I held her hand while she whispered her final requests, listened while she made me promise to protect her daughter and preserve her medical knowledge. For 20 years, I've kept those promises as best I could. She moved to stand beside Clara and Ruthie, her small frame somehow commanding attention from everyone in the room. Lily Washington saved my husband's life in 1859, along with dozens of others who would have died without her care. She asked for nothing in return except the promise that this community would remember what healing really means. Not profit, not social status, but human compassion. Her eyes swept across the faces of her neighbors, reading recognition and shame in expressions that had tried to remain neutral. If we close this clinic, if we choose comfort over conscience, we betray every sacrifice she made for our survival. Mrs. Miller stepped forward then, her arms still full of the clean linen she'd brought to help prepare the clinic. "Mrs. Henderson's right. My own children benefited from treatments Lily Washington developed, remedies that saved their lives during the scarlet fever outbreak of '61. Jake Morrison, the blacksmith, moved from his position near the door to stand with the growing group supporting the clinic. My pa always said Lily Washington was the finest healer he'd ever seen, better than most doctors with fancy degrees. Said she understood something about medicine that couldn't be taught in schools, that healing was about serving people, not serving money. One by one, other community members began to shift their positions, literally and figuratively, moving from neutral ground to stand either with those supporting the clinic or those opposing it. The physical movement created a visible representation of Cedar Creek's moral divide, making it impossible for anyone to remain uncommitted. Tommy Walsh left his position near the medicine cabinet to join the supporters, his young face flushed with nervous excitement. Mr. Hoffman won't like it, but I've seen too many good people turned away from the apothecary because they couldn't pay full price. Maybe it's time medicine served people instead of the other way around. Doc Peterson moved to the examining table where Silas's badge lay beside Lily Washington's notebook, symbolically linking law enforcement with medical care, authority with service. I've practiced medicine for 30 years, and I can tell you that the best healers understand something that business-minded people often forget. Health is a basic human need, not a luxury commodity. But the opposition was organizing as well. Mr. Thornton stepped forward with his legal documents, his banker's instincts clearly alarmed by the financial implications of what was being proposed. This is all very touching, but sentiment doesn't pay for medicine, doesn't fund medical facilities, doesn't create sustainable healthcare systems. Good intentions without proper funding create more problems than they solve. Then help us solve the funding problem, Clara said quietly, her voice carrying the strength that had sustained her through months of illness and poverty. Instead of using financial concerns as an excuse to do nothing, help us find ways to make compassionate care financially viable. Mrs. Patterson looked around the room with obvious frustration, recognizing that her position was losing ground to emotional appeals and moral arguments. You're all being naive. Open this clinic, and within 6 months you'll be overwhelmed with demands you can't meet, expectations you can't fulfill. The community will be bankrupt trying to provide free care to everyone who needs it. Maybe, Silas acknowledged, picking up his badge and turning it over in his weathered hands. But maybe the alternative is bankruptcy of a different kind, moral bankruptcy, the kind that lets children beg for their parents' lives, while adults debate procedures and precedents. He looked directly at Mayor Franklin, his expression calm but resolute. You can remove me from office, but you can't remove me from this community. You can threaten legal action, but you can't threaten the moral obligation. We all share to take care of our neighbors. Franklin's shoulders sagged slightly as he recognized that institutional authority alone was insufficient to resolve conflicts rooted in fundamental questions of human dignity and community responsibility. Silas, you're forcing me into a position where I have to choose between law and order on one hand and justice and compassion on the other, Silas finished. That's exactly the choice I'm asking you to make, Franklin. The same choice everyone in this room has to make. Reverend McKinley stepped forward then, his presence adding moral weight to the growing coalition supporting the clinic. The scriptures teach us that faith without works is dead, that love without action is meaningless. If we claim to be a Christian community while abandoning our most vulnerable members, what exactly are we claiming to believe? The crowd outside had grown larger, pressing against the windows and filling the street beyond. Word had spread throughout Cedar Creek that something significant was happening at the old clinic, that their community was being transformed by forces they didn't fully understand but instinctively recognized as momentous. Ruthie tugged at Silas's coat sleeve, her small hand drawing his attention down to her upturned face. Sheriff Dorsey, are they going to let you help sick people, or are they going to make you stop? The question, asked with the devastating simplicity that only children can achieve, cut through all the adult complications and exposed the essential moral choice facing their community. Everyone present understood that their answer would determine not just the fate of the clinic, but the character of Cedar Creek itself. Silas knelt down to meet Ruthie's eyes directly, his voice gentle, but carrying clearly through the silent room. "I don't know what they're going to decide, child. But I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to keep helping people who need help, no matter what anyone else says about it." He stood slowly, pinning his badge back to his vest with deliberate ceremony, the gesture signaling that he had found a way to reconcile official duty with moral obligation. The law exists to serve justice, not the other way around. If enforcing the law means abandoning justice, then the law needs to change. The clinic doors stood open to the street beyond, their frames representing more than architectural features. They symbolized accessibility, openness, the radical idea that medical care should be available to anyone who needed it. Regardless of their ability to pay, the confrontation had reached its resolution, but the outcome remained uncertain. Would Cedar Creek choose the path of compassion and justice, or would it retreat into the comfortable inequities of its past? 3 months later, the patient ledger at the Dorsey, Washington Community Clinic told the story of a community transformed. The heavy book, bound in leather and marked with careful entries in Doc Peterson's precise handwriting, recorded treatments that ranged from broken bones to difficult births, from childhood fevers to the inevitable ailments of advancing age. But more than medical data, each entry represented a life touched, a family helped, a neighbor served without regard to their ability to pay. Clara Johnson's name appeared frequently in those pages, not as a patient, but as an assistant. Her recovery had progressed remarkably, aided not just by proper medicine, but by the sense of purpose that came from helping others. She'd proven to have inherited her mother's intuitive understanding of healing, along with a gentle bedside manner that put frightened children and worried parents at ease. On this particular autumn morning, she worked alongside Doc Peterson to treat Mrs. Kowalski's twin boys, both suffering from the respiratory ailments that commonly plagued the territory's harsh winters. The medicine came from the clinic's well-stocked supply, purchased with donations from community members who had discovered that supporting healing felt better than hoarding wealth. "Mama, look what I found," Ruthie called from the clinic's front room, where she'd been organizing supplies after school. She held up a small wooden sign, beautifully carved and painted with words that sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. "All who suffer welcome here. Lily Washington Memorial Clinic." Clara wiped her hands on her apron and moved to examine the sign, running her fingers over the careful lettering that transformed her mother's legacy into something visible and permanent. "Where did this come from, baby?" "Jake Morrison made it," Ruthie explained proudly. "He said every important place needs a proper sign, and this is the most important place in town." Through the clinic's front windows, they could see Cedar Creek going about its daily business with rhythms that had subtly shifted over the past months. The changes weren't dramatic, no parades or proclamations marked the community's moral evolution, but they were real and growing deeper with each passing day. Mrs. Patterson still crossed the street to avoid walking directly past the clinic, her disapproval undiminished, but no longer influential enough to sway community opinion. Mr. Thornton had grudgingly admitted that the clinic's operations hadn't bankrupted the town, though he continued to predict financial disaster with the persistence of someone who had invested too much credibility in being proven right. But for every holdout, there were 3 new supporters. Families who had once feared seeking medical care now brought their concerns to the clinic without shame or hesitation. Children played in the small garden that had been planted behind the building, their laughter providing a soundtrack to the healing that happened inside. Even former opponents like Mayor Franklin had begun to speak cautiously about the clinic's positive impact, though he still insisted that exceptional circumstances required exceptional responses. Sheriff Silas Dorsey, He'd kept the badge and the title. After the town council discovered that removing a popular sheriff over matters of conscience created more political problems than allowing him to continue, sat on the clinic's front porch. In the early evening light, watching his community with the satisfied expression of a man who had found his purpose. The rocking chair had been Margaret's, brought from their home after Clara suggested that patients' families needed a comfortable place to wait during lengthy treatments. It seemed fitting that furniture associated with his late wife should serve this new chapter of community care, linking past sorrows to present healing in ways that made both more meaningful. "Penny for your thoughts," Doc Peterson said, settling into the adjacent chair with the weary satisfaction of someone who had spent a productive day serving others, just thinking about how different this place looks when you pay attention to the right things, Silas replied, his weathered hands folded in his lap and his steel-grey eyes taking in familiar sights with new appreciation. Where he once saw only the comfortable prosperity of Cedar Creek's main street, he now noticed the subtle signs of struggle and resilience that had always been present but ignored. Mrs. Henderson hanging wash that was patched but clean. Tommy Walsh walking with the confident stride of someone who had chosen conscience over convenience. Children playing games that mixed wealthy families' offspring with those from the settlement's margins. Their friendships uncomplicated by adult prejudices. "Your father would be proud," Peterson observed, following Silas's gaze to the clinic's carved sign. This is exactly what he envisioned when he established the original facility: medicine as service, healing as community responsibility. "He'd be prouder of Clara," Silas said. "She's the one who transformed this from charity into justice, who helped us understand that we weren't doing anyone favors, we were fulfilling obligations that should never have been forgotten." As if summoned by their conversation, Clara emerged from the clinic with Ruthie at her side, both carrying the quiet satisfaction that came from work well done. Clara had gained weight over the past months. Her color had returned to healthy warmth, and her movements carried the easy confidence of someone whose strength had been fully restored. "How was Mrs. Kowalski's boys?" Silas asked, though Clara's expression already suggested good news, responding well to treatment. "They'll be fine within the week." Clara settled on the porch steps beside Ruthie, her daughter automatically leaning against her in the comfortable intimacy of people who had survived hard times together. "Doc Peterson says we've treated over 200 patients since opening. 200 people who might have suffered in silence or done without care entirely. 200 reasons why this was the right thing to do," Ruthie added, with the moral certainty of someone whose worldview had been shaped by witnessing adult courage in action. The sun was setting behind the mountains that surrounded Cedar Creek, casting long shadows down the town's main street and painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that promised fair weather tomorrow. Somewhere in those shadows, the future was quietly arranging itself around the changes they had initiated, creating possibilities that none of them could fully envision, but all of them had helped to nurture. Sometimes a child's desperate plea really could change everything. Sometimes one act of unexpected kindness could ripple outward through a community, touching lives and changing hearts in ways that transformed the very foundations of how people related to one another. In the patient ledger that would be filled with tomorrow's entries, in the medicine cabinet stocked with remedies available to anyone who needed them, in the carved sign that proclaimed welcome to all who suffered, the legacy of Lily Washington lived on. Her sacrifice had not been forgotten. Her daughter's dignity had been restored. Her vision of healing as universal right rather than economic privilege had been given new life. And in a small frontier town that had learned to choose compassion over comfort, justice over convenience, human dignity over social order, the quiet revolution continued, one patient at a time, one family at a time, one act of kindness at a time. The story that had begun with 3 crumpled dollar bills and a child's desperate plea had become something larger and more lasting, a community's decision to become worthy of its most vulnerable members' trust. It was a story worth telling, worth remembering, and worth living every day in the choices that defined who they were and who they aspired to be.